Chapter 44. The woods around Kentucky had been cleared, leaving no true cover close to the palisade. The five of them instead gathered around a half-abandoned fire pit about 30 feet out, roughly to the west of the town. It had a rack propped up over it that Ferranda said was for smoking meat, and they all felt a little sick at the thought of what kind of meat that might mean. Devils were said to prefer eating men whilst they lived, but they were not above feasting on corpses. Regardless of that understated horror, the pause was most welcome. They were all tired and out of breath, in stark need of reprieve. Not that it was only that, for now that the enemy was out of sight, Angerade's oaths were put to the question. This was badly done, Tredegar, Shalini bit out. She didn't promise a thing, Gull, Lan cut in. Our good lordling swore to return me unharmed, yeah. The Tiangsi pointed at the cut on her neck. He let her out of the oath before he even agreed to it. Eyes turned to her and Angharade shrugged. I expected him to catch the detail and amend the wording, she admitted. I agreed because the oath was easy to negate regardless. We could simply warn the watch that one of the trial takers feigned their death, then point at every other deceased from the Bluebell Manifest and specify it was not them. So long as Augusto was not outright named, the oath was not broken. Huh? Shalini finally said. He's the one who asked for that wording. I'm surprised he didn't think of that. He was on edge, Lan told them. Even more than you'd think. He kept talking to himself and the cultists avoided being anywhere near him. I do not think his contract did heal him, Song said, and that earned instant attention. Angharade knew more about the Tiangsi's pact than most, but by now most everyone had figured out that those silver eyes gave her insight into the workings of spirits. The red eye, it is a god of feeding, she continued. When Felis bargained with it, his wound was not healed. He closed it with some sort of red crystal that fed on his body. Why would Augusto Cherton get a better bargain, when he would have bargained from even worse a position? He had a hole through his body, Song, Ferranda flatly said. He no longer does. I don't think that's actually true, the Tiangsi replied. I think that his wounds are still there but that he can fill them up, but that, like the red eye, he must keep feeding for them to stay filled. Lan let out a low whistle. So the old god's a lone shark, she said. Our boy Augusto has to keep what? Eating human flesh so what grew back doesn't wither. No wonder he thinks the watch will blow his brains out if they catch him. Something like that, Song agreed. I imagine his pact lends him a way to feed at a touch, if the cultists fear it coming close. We should take care to avoid getting close to him, then, Angharade said. You say that like you are not planning to kill him before night's end, Ferranda said. Though I will admit I am not sure how you would get around the terms. That oath does seem pretty straightforward, Shalini agreed, cocking an eyebrow. Tredegar? The terms were simple enough, that was true. She was to commit no violence against Augusto Cherton nor allow her companions to do the same, or attempt to imprison him nor allow her companions to do the same, until 24 hours had passed. Only he had not though to anchor the oath in. In the distance, the night lit up with thunder. No, she realized. Not thunder. These were cannons. And the shattering cacophony inside Kentucky revealed exactly what they were being turned on. Sowing fire and screams. The five of them went still, like rabbits before a wolf, as bombardment began in earnest from north of the town, where they had been headed. Those are Gujiwi rounds, Song finally spoke into the silence. Shalini breathed in sharply. Thunder shells? She said. I thought the Republics kept a tight lid on those. They sell them to the watch, Lan said, with strange certainty. Sometimes the crates are kept in Sacramonte warehouses until they can be distributed to the right garrison force. Angharade could feel the capital letter on garrison, even in Antigua. It was not unwarranted, for though the free companies of the watch made up the majority of its numbers, the ruling council of the Black Cloaks, the Conclave, commanded the single largest number of soldiers in black cloaks. They must, to protect their Trebian territories and uphold their duties under the Iscariot Accords. The soldiers of the garrison were considered second-rate compared to the more glamorous company men, Angharade knew, but that only meant so much. Getting bit by a hound instead of a wolf was hardly kinder on the hand. It occurred to the noblewoman a moment later that Lan, given her unseemly origins, might well be so certain because she had participated in robbing the watch. It was somewhat embarrassing it had taken her so long to catch that, but for all the woman's sacramental quirks she had to admit that Lan did not act much like she had imagined a criminal would. She was clean and well-spoken, not constantly drunk and disorderly, and as far as Angharad could tell she was not constantly lying. It would be a stretch to call her an honorable woman, but Angharad would hesitate to say she was even half as detestable as the likes of Augusto Cherton, to whom she had once so thoughtlessly granted the presumption of honor. If the watch is shelling Kentika, it'll be to soften up the opposition before they storm it, Shalini said. That means they have troops on the way, probably come from Three Pines. Which means we could take refuge with them if we head north, Lady Firanda said. That seems the wisest course left open to us. That path takes us by the postern gate, Angharad said. The others will be trying to evacuate through there. It seems to me we could attempt to join up on the way. She had expected to have to fight some of the others for this, particularly Shalini and Firanda, but they found the two quite agreeable to the suggestion. Zenzel is still with the others, she realized after a moment. It was Lan that objected, though in words carefully coached to give no offense. I do not mean to linger overlong, Angharad assured her. Only to ascertain if we might bolster our numbers on the way north. There will be a lot of rats trying to leave that sinking ship, Lady Tredegar, Lan warned her. We're just as likely to run into enemies as friends. It was true, she knew, but yet worth trying. As everyone save Lan shared her opinion, there was no further debate and they headed out briskly. Kentika was not so large that it would take long to get past the town, and they were already on the right side to reach the postern gate anyhow. It was but the work of minutes to make their way there on yellow grass, weapons out and eyes wary. The postern gate was carefully hidden from the outside, made to look part of the palisade, but their crew had the advantage of having song among it, so Angharad hardly worried at finding it. Even that hardly proved unnecessary, as there was no missing the gate when they got there. It was wide open. Eyes sweeping their surroundings, Angharad found nothing but an expanse of empty yellow grass from the edge of the woods to their west and the palisade to their east. The open grounds continued to the north in a wide curve until they reached the continuation of the beaten earth road leading to the port of Three Pines. Inside the town, past the palisade, they could hear the roar of flames and the occasional shot as the watch's bombardment continued to methodically demolish Kentika. They might have left it open after Augusto let them in, Lady Firanda said. Smells like ambush, Shalini grunted back, shaking her head. No sign of our companions, Lan said. We should move on. Angharad hesitated. She liked the look of this no more than Shalini, but an empty field was no reason to leave behind comrades. They could at least. Movement, Song suddenly said, musket rising. Only she was not looking at the open gate, Angharad realized, but the woods, from which a cultist war band was charging out. He wasn't sure how long he sat there in the dark, with only a shuttered lantern with company, but it was a relief when someone craned their neck past the edge of the trapdoor. I hope you're down there, because if you aren't I'm going to have to drop him and I'm not sure he'll live, Mariam called out. Please do not, Zenzel Duma croaked. I will most definitely die. Huh? He thought as he got on his feet. The Milani had lived, fancy that. I'll admit, Tristan called back, even opening with a sword in the back, I figured Tupac would kill you. Stop taunting him and help me get him down that ladder, Mariam said. The last shell hit just a few blocks away, I do not care to stay out here. He opened the lantern's shutters and moved to lend a hand as had been requested. And a hand was most definitely needed, for Zenzel Duma looked as if he had been thrown down a hill made of blades. He no longer bore his coat and his shirt was ripped clean through, revealing a nasty gut wound as well as a deep cut that went from the side of his torso to right below the hollow of his neck. Tristan thought one of his arms might be broken as well, for he used only one to move down the ladder, but found it was truly because the Milani was cradling something in his hand. It was only when Zenzel turned to be helped down the last rungs that the thief saw the worst wound of them all. His right eye had been ripped through, Roughly enough, it must be the work of nails and not a blade. Tristan swallowed. Not a pretty sight, is it? Zenzel weakly laughed. And I did not even kill the bastard. While he might well have killed me, had cultists not come looking because of Cosm's shot. That and Lady Sarah's priceless help, of course. Call me Mariam, she said as she came down the ladder, closing the trapdoor behind her. I suppose that game has finally run its course. She glanced at the Mulaney, not harshly but without much kindness either. And it was luck on your part, Duma. If I hadn't run into them myself I wouldn't have doubled back and found you lying there. Tristan helped the man to lower himself and sit against the wall, still clutching something in his hand. Try stabbing the head first, next time, Tristan advised. Works better than the back. Zenzel convulsed, letting out a ragged wheezing sound. Sleeping God, Tristan, don't make me laugh, he said. I think it makes my inside bleed. The thief mercifully spared him further amusement, finding Mariam looking at him with a raised eyebrow. I did get something from him, yes, Zenzel muttered, seeming to talk to no one in particular. He will remember it. And the dark-skinned man finally loosened his grip, smiling as he revealed the eye on the palm of his hand. It was cut up and red, but Tristan had seen the teary paleness often enough to recognize it. That was Tupac Sickle's eye, he was sure of it. Zenzel murmured unintelligibly after that, staring at nothing as he sagged against the stone. He dips in and out of things, Mariam said. I don't suppose you have anything left for pain? Clean out, Tristan said. I can clean some of his wounds and bandage them, at least. Please do, she said. Blue eyes moved to the corner, where the shadows half-cloaked Cosm's body. Zenzel had been too out of it to notice. Did you get what you wanted? Mariam quietly asked. From him? Enough. In the pale lantern light, the sharp cast and colors of her hardly seemed a woman's, like sapphires cast in marble, too angular to have been born and not carved. But did you get what you want? She asked again. He breathed out. It is not finished, he said. There are 4 others left before the account is settled. She sighed. I suppose it was too much to hope you would be done with it, Mariam said. Will you try for Augusto? Tristan shrugged. The watch will have him marked for death, he said. I see no pressing need to pull the trigger myself. So you can be taught, Shidali said. Promising. The thief licked his lips, unsure of what he had to say but certain of the need for it. Before, he said. When I left you behind, I do not care for apologies, Mariam told him. I have. I understand the demands the past can make, let us leave it at that. If your actions bring you sorrow, Tristan, do not repeat them. The past is a dead thing. He passed a hand through his hair, feeling so very tired. I'll not excuse or justify, Tristan finally said. But when I go for the second name, it will be in a manner that does not lead me to regrets. She studied him for a moment. My mother always said that no amount of regrets will build a cairn, but she was a hard woman, Mariam said. Too hard, in some ways. It was why her men gave her up to the Mulaney at the end. He hardly dared breathe, for never before had Mariam spoken a word of her past. It matters, that you regret it, she said. But only so much. Remember that, next time you stand at that same crossroads. The pale woman reached for her bag, claiming something inside, and offered it to him. Even in this trembling light, Tristan could not mistake it for anything else. Young's pistol, the grip held towards him. The same he had left in the mud when he ran after Cosm. The rat swallowed, licking his cracked lips. You picked it up, he dumbly said. Mariam pressed it into his palms, closed his fingers around it. Once, she warned. Before Angharad could so much as open her mouth, Lan fled. Back the same way they had come, straight south, as fast as her legs could carry her. The noblewoman hesitated, then moved to join her, looking at the others. Sun caught her by the shoulder. We have to go back in the town, she said. Now. Angharad gaped. There was bravery and then there was foolishness. If everyone was fleeing Kentika, then there might be devils headed for that very postern gate right now. She was not the only to think this madness. The cultists were gaining on them, even if they were still far out. At least a dozen of them, all running. That's going to get us killed, Shalini said. Every second we are not running south a shot rang out and they all flinched. Into the town, Sung hissed. They have muskets, we can't stay in the open. Heart in her throat, Angharad turned and saw exactly what she feared. Lan was on the ground. It was her the cultists had been aiming at. She was still moving, struggling to get up, but the shot had clearly hit here. Don't you dare, Sung began, but she was already running. She glimpsed ahead and banked hard to the left to avoid getting shot in the gut, Sung putting a bullet in the shooter's head a heartbeat later. Her legs burned but she ran, glimpsing again. She had to slide low, boots ripping into dead grass to avoid another shot. Sung was reloading, could not silence the enemy twice in such quick succession. Lan turned to her, her side bleeding, and got on her knees. Angharad scrambled back up, glimpsing again, and saw the shot before it happened. The bullet took Lan in the cheek, as if some invisible mob bit through flesh and bone, and it was mercy the impact spun her around. What little of that death Angharad had just seen she would not soon forget. Creak, she finished, nauseous. Come back, you damn fool, Sung snarled. They were going for the door, all three of them, but only Shalini had her eyes on it. Sung and Firanda had their muskets out and were firing at the cultists, covering her still. Three of the war band had split off to go after her, Angharad saw, but she was faster. Her legs were longer. She left them behind, the one who came closest shot in the leg by Firanda, and Sung slew another hollow musketman without batting an eye. She caught up to them just as they got to the open postern gate, hollows close on her heels. Shalini was ushering them one after another, eyes calm. Angharad passed her, feeling a hand pat her back, and the Someshwari moved so quickly after that she barely even caught it. A heartbeat, then smoke billowed and Shalini had two pistols in hand. Two cultists dropped dead, the others tripping into them, and the Someshwari slammed the door behind them. She locked it after her as Angharad stumbled forward, panting from the fear and run on the companion she had failed to protect. If she had been just a little faster, cut it closer with the shot she had slid to avoid. Firanda squeezed her shoulder. You tried, the Infanzona said. Eyes up, Angharad. We're not out of trouble yet. She swallowed, shaking off the other woman, but a look around told her that Firanda Vilazar had the right of it. They were not out of trouble yet, for before the mud of Kantika's streets was filled with corpses. The sight of that silent spread of death filled her with more dread than the sound of cultists trying to jostle the postern gate open behind them, slamming fists against the wood and unloading their muskets. It was not the bombardment that had done this, they could all see it plain. The heaps of hollows and devils had been killed the hard way, cracked and cut and pierced. Some devils looked like their torso had been pulped, the remains disgusting to behold. Mayonnaise, Firanda breathed out. What did this? In the distance there was a shrill scream, the sound of it like walking on broken glass. They all flinched. Whatever it was, it is no longer here, Sung said. Best to get gun before it returns. In the distance, another shell lit up the dark as it hit Kantika. The bombardment was tapering down, but it was not yet done. We need to leave this town, Angharad said, then sighed. Again. The main gates, then, Shalini said. I don't think our friends outside are going to be letting us pass through. As if to agree with her, a cultist unloaded into the door again. Not that muskets would help Eddie there, Angharad thought. The door was thick, solid wood. Odd that they would waste powder on it when that was plain to see. I see no better plan to be had, Sung finally said. Firanda? Sounds better than joining them, the Infanzona said, nodding at the corpses. They set out as quickly and quietly as they could. The fastest path would be south of the main street, but that was too likely to find them a fight. They kept 2 streets off instead, even if it would take them longer with all the detours. Much of the town was on fire, now, and they hardly needed a lantern to see. It was why Angharad saw them at the same time he saw them. Walking down the street alone, humming, Mayor Crespin had not a mark on him save for some ash on his clothes. Even his shell was pristine, Knuckles barely scoffed, though there was some blood around his mouth and under his fingernails. The four of them slowed at the sight of him, fear and quietly cursing. Angharai's lips thinned. There was no fire on this part of the street, only dark and empty houses with tiled roofs on both sides. I don't like the look of that fight, Shalini admitted. They would, Angharai suspected, have a choice of whether or not it was to be fought. Before she could call out, the approaching devil broke the silence. You returned, Mayor Crespin said, sounding baffled. Why, nay, it matters not. Let us put an end to our pointless palaver. Kentika has breathed its last, I must make arrangement. Angharai's jaw tightened. I will get close, she said. Try to get shots in, pinning him is our best chance. Your best, Crespin replied, revealing rows and rows of teeth, is not enough. There was a sharp whistling sound. For a moment Angharai hoped a shell was falling. Instead the devil's hand reared up, catching what she realized was a stone. Polished and the size of a small fist, but very much a stone. The devil let out an amused noise. A slinger, he said, tossing the stone behind him. How nostalgic. He was looking up at the roof to their side, and Angharai followed his gaze. There was a man up there, in a black cloak. She caught a glimpse of Aslan features under the cloak, then the watchman raised a hand. He snapped his fingers and there was sudden buzzing sound. Mayor Crespin's arm down to the elbow, the same that had caught the stone, was pulped. The devil screamed, legs ripping free from his shell like it were paper, but liquid darkness formed a circle with something inside it just above his head. Angharai's gaze shied away from the sign, even as the devil turned limp for a heartbeat. A heartbeat was all it took, for another blast cloak emerged from the dark of an alley behind the mirror. They bore a long spear, no, a harpoon. The head was barbed. The sign above the devil dissolved a heartbeat before the harpoon went into his back. Crespin screamed and struggled, but the watchman danced away. The harpoon did not move, however, as if stuck in the air, and the devil was stuck on it. All yours, Lieutenant, the blast cloak said. A woman, Angharai caught. There was a Tianxi lilt to her words. The slinger above chuckled, taking his time to place another stone on a leather strap at the end of a rope and swing it. The stone hit the devil in its head this time, despite Crespin's desperate struggles. The lieutenant snapped his fingers and buzzing sound returned, even louder. A heartbeat later, the Devi's torso was black mulch and Angharai swallowed, unsure whether she felt disgust or awe. Impressive, isn't it? The noblewoman nearly leapt out of her skin, reaching for her saber until she found a knife lazily pressed against her throat. There was a fourth blast cloak next to her, and from the shouts of the others they had just noticed it as well. How? They had been in the middle of the alley. Don't think too hard on it, Tredegar, the blast cloak teased as they drew back the blade, face hidden under the hood. You might sprain something. You know who I am. She got out. I read the docket for the recommended, the watchman said. Headed for the Skiratai, is it? You'll have to work on your awareness, else they might decide you need to be taught. I will, Angharai slowly said, keep that in mind. Sir? Sir will work, the watchman said. The four of you surviving should count as a trial of weeds complete, given the circumstances. Congratulations in advance. The watch is already inside the town? Sung asked. You are still shelling it. The Aslan with the sling, the one the other had called Lieutenant, leapt down from the roof and landed in the mud with a wet squelch. Not the regulars, girl, just us, he said. We are cleaning house with the worst of the lot before the palisade is breached and the proper sweep begins. There was another of those ear-splitting screams in the distance. Enough chit-chat, the lieutenant grunted. Camellia's taking too long with the saint. There's a saint here? Ferranda asked, sounding worried. The priestess leading the war band pulled a little too deep, the watchman that had put a knife to her throat said. Useful in cleaning up the devils, but she is a feeder. Those are always tricky to kill. Song cleared her throat. Lieutenant, she said, I understand that you have a charge, but if one of your squads could spare the blast cloak with the harpoon, who had just ripped it out of the mayor's remains, let out a snort. Cruz? she said. "There's only us, girl." The commander knew it'd be excessive force already. "5 of you," Angharade slowly said. "5 of you did what we saw at the entrance?" "It was getting boring in Three Pines," the lieutenant shrugged. "It's good to stretch our legs now and then." That hadn't been what the chatty one she had called Sir clapped her shoulder, overly friendly. "I would recommend hiding out in the west of town until it's over," they said. "We already cleaned it up. Don't go through the main gates." "Why?" Angharade asked. "The regulars set up a killing field there," the lieutenant said. "They'll shoot on sight." He whistled sharply afterwards, striding away without another word. The harpooner followed, and the navigator had never come out in the first place. "Good luck," the chatty one said, waving back as he followed, walking backwards. "Try not to die. I have coin riding on you and Duma making it to the end." The 4 of them were left there standing in the street, as if a storm had just blown through. Sleeping God, Angharade thought, remembering the copper of corpses. 5 of them. Shalini cleared her throat. "West, then?" she tried. It seemed a sounder notion than being shot by their own rescuers, at least. "I know a place," Angharade said. By the time Tristan finished seeing to Zenzel's wounds, the Milani was alert again. Pain was a fine enough anchor, and there was only so gentle the thief could be when cleaning wounds that serious. He was thanked, afterwards, and that courtesy extended to the young lord, pretending he could not see Cosm's corpse in the corner of the room. Tristan had considered throwing in the jail in the back, but Zenzel had already known what he intended and could out him for it should he wish. It had also been pretty funny to watch the Milani have to pretend there wasn't a dead man a couple of feet away from him, which might have weighed on his decision more than was strictly wise. "The shelling has stopped," Mariam noted. "I expect the watch will assaulting the town soon. Now would be the time to get out, if we do not want to be stuck between the Hollows and the Rooks," Tristan agreed. "Lord Zenzel, would you feel up to the trip?" The man hesitated. "If you help me," he finally said. "We risk cultists coming here to hide if we stay much longer anyhow, and I mean no insult, but I do not believe we would prevail in such an encounter." Tristan, who had over the last few days been savagely beaten not once but twice by grey hairs, saw no grounds to argue that point. He was honestly unsure if Lord Zenzel might not be the best fighter of them still even in his state. "We could take on 1 hollow," Mariam firmly said. 2, if they're children," Tristan added. Zenzel convulsed again, breath wheezing. "What did I say?" he gasped, "about making me laugh?" It was more laborious than difficult getting him out of the jail after that, Mariam heading up to drag him by the shoulders while Tristan stood below to push him up by the waist. The thief got out with the lantern in hand while Zenzel leaned against Mariam for support. "Should I ask what happened to Cosmo Flor?" the Milani lord casually asked. "Lost him in the chaos," Tristan just as casually replied. "Who knows? He might have fallen down some stairs." "Very sharp stairs indeed," Zenzel muttered, and asked no more. Large swaths of the town were on fire, but the southern part, close to the main gates, seemed to have been the least ravaged by the bombardment. To Tristan that reeked of leaving a hole in the barrel so you knew where the water would go, even more so when he risked climbing atop a half-wrecked house and stood on the roof to have a look at the rest of Kentucky. There was a hole in the palisade to the north of the town, and the watch seemed to be sweeping towards the south street by street. He climbed down to tell them as much, and Zenzel grimaced. "They are driving the Hollows out into the open grounds to the south," the Milani said. "They must already have men in place there. They left a path out so they will not have to dig them up street by street." "That will become good news in a while," Tristan said, "but until then it means that every surviving Hollow and Devil in Kentucky is being driven our way." A heartbeat passed. "We could go back in the hole," Mariam reluctantly said. Zenzel Duma looked as if he did not know whether to laugh or cry. "That would be even riskier than we thought," Tristan said. "It's a good place to ride out the watch sweep, and there's former slaves with the cultists. At least some of them will know the place." "Heading towards the gate would be worse," Mariam said. "Everyone else will be doing the same." "We could try to hide." "Stop," Zenzel hoarsely whispered. "We need to hide right now." His eyes were wide but clear, and though he was looking at thin air, that did not necessarily mean he was raving. Tristan caught Mariam's gaze and nodded, the two of them helping the Millennium limp towards the back of the piles of lumber. "Quick, he's close now," the Lord said. "Who?" Mariam asked. "Augusto Cherton," Zenzel replied. "Black cords for all three of us. He wants, needs, maybe, us dead." That, Tristan thought, sounded like a very useful contract. He'd not even said anything, and still he found Fortuna sitting on a roof and glaring down at him as he helped lead Zenzel into a small dead-end alley behind the wood piles. He sneered back at her. If she did not want him to have contract envy, then perhaps she should have offered better goods. It was a very expressive sneer, as proved by his goddess-outraged cry. While the thief had no great love for dead-end alleys, it was the best they could do as a hiding place in a hurry, and if it came to running, it was likely Zenzel was dead anyway. The two of them lowered him behind a barrel of dirty rainwater, his back to it so his legs wouldn't stick out, and the thief handed Mariam the lantern so she could shutter it. Just in time, as they all heard urgently speaking voices approach. "It's close to here, I swear," a woman's voice said in Antigua. Tristan crept to the edge of the alley, crouching low, and risked a look. 5 people had come from the west of Kentica, and though he could only make them out partly through the gap in wood piles, the thief saw enough. 3 armed and scarred men, cultists. A fair-haired woman in rags and badly bruised, likely a former slave. And, as Zenzel had warned, Augusto Cherton. "It had better be," Augusto said. "If you wasted our time, perhaps it will lead to our deaths, but I assure you, it will lead to yours first." Ah, infanzones. How lucky for the rest of Vesper that they now got to experience their particular charms. "My brother helped dig it," the woman insisted. "We'll have to crawl, but it gets us past the palisade." Tristan stilled. Some kind of tunnel out? No, anything that large would have been noticed. More a crevice to squeeze through, likely widened as discreetly as the slaves could. While the thief would have preferred it should that crew be headed for the jail, it would have been child's play to lock them up inside. He would settle for them showing him a way out of this town. A glance back showed him that Zenzel was safely tucked away behind the barrel and Mariam doing her best to hide herself behind him. There was hardly anywhere for him to hide, even were he inclined to try. It was better to move. Tristan crept away silently, moving behind one of the wood piles. The hollows had no lantern, but one of them did hold a torch, which he kept high while the sole woman among them began patting away the bottom of the palisade past the lumberyard. Careful to position himself so someone wandering in from the north of the town, the thief settled in to wait them out. They hardly seemed to be paying attention to their surroundings, but that did not mean they were not dangerous. One of the cultists said something to Augusto, too low for Tristan to overhear, and the infanzon gestured impatiently at him. "So go and piss, then," the Cherton bit out. "And do it out of my sight. None of us need to see whatever tumor passes for your cock." The other 2 cultists laughed, speaking quickly in a cant. The tone, though, was universal. They were making fun of the third, and not nicely. The cultists stomped away angrily, scowling, and that was their luck turned. Because when Tristan realized the man was headed their way, he was able to move around the wood pile and keep himself out of the sight, but the moment the cultists saw there was an alley, he headed straight there. And Hollow saw better in the dark, so he was sure to see Mariam even if he missed Zenzel. Fuck, Tristan thought, palming his blackjack. Even if he took out the man before he could shout, the others would notice in short order. They'd have to grab Zenzel and flee immediately, else they would be forced into a fight they were sure to lose. Augusto alone might have been enough to kill them, with that brutal contract of his. Throwing in warriors too was smothering all hope. Biding his time, the thief circled entirely around the woodpile as the cultist walked past it and ended up at the man's back. Grunting as he approached the alley, the man propped his spear against the side of the shed at the corner and reached for his trousers. Tristan followed, steps silent and arm raised, as the cultist reached the alley and found it. And it all went to the dogs. The cultist turned to look back, catching Tristan with his hand raised, and the thief struck, but it was already too late. The man got off half a shout before the blackjack hit the side of his head, and he moved with a hip besides. Dazed but not unconscious. Cursing, the thief struck down at the crown of his head, but the hollow got his hands up in time and tackled him. They rolled on the ground even as the cultist shouted out in cant. "Move," Mariam growled. Obeying half on instinct, Tristan elbowed the cultist and threw himself off. A heartbeat later Mariam impaled the man with his own spear, right in the belly. The thief scrambled to his feet, looking back at the others as she coldly finished off the dying man, and saw trouble. The other two cultists were headed their way, Augusto elbowing them aside to take the lead. "Is that you, rat?" he called out. "We need to draw them away," Tristan murmured to Mariam. "They might miss Zenzel." She nodded. "Lord Augusto," Tristan called out, smiling winningly. "What a coincidence to run into you here." "Why, I was hoping, take him alive," Augusto ordered the cultists. "Unless you'd prefer me topping off on one of you." Neither man looked pleased at the threat, but they were more fearful than angry. "It seems we got off on the wrong foot," Tristan said, edging away from the alley. "I shall, leave you to your business. Good luck you, my lord." Mariam raised the spear, which she seemed to have some training in using, and withdrew with him as the hollows approached. Both were armed, and no doubt better fighters. It'd be best to run now. It would also get them running after without first looking. A strangled, coughing last came from the alley and Tristan almost cursed. There was no way the cultists had missed that. Zenzel was good as dead. "You fool," he hissed. "What was so funny it was worth slitting your own throat?" "They're all fucked," Zenzel croaked back. A heartbeat later a shot took the lead cultist in the throat, blood spattering wood, and the other one barely had the time to turn before death was on him. He thrust his spear, but Angharad Tredegar pivoted around the blow like they were dancing, arm striking out like she knew where his neck was going to be an entire second before it got there. The cultist's head fell on the floor, his body staying upright for a moment after, and the mirror dancer did not even stop moving. Just like that, easy as snuffing out a candle. "You again," Augusto snarled, stepping back in fear. "You got out. What are you doing?" "That is none of your concern," the Perdiri replied. She was not alone. Shalini and Firanda stood by her side, and by that perfect shot earlier Song must not be far either. Had Lan ditched them? Likely, if they'd gone back into the town. She was too clever a rat to let herself be talked into that. Feeling rather outnumbered, the Infanzon cast a look around and found the same thing Tristan had just noticed. The woman left while they were all distracted. Whether she had found her crevice or just legged it he had no idea, but good on her. Wisest thing anyone had done all night. "I am still protected by your oath," Augusto called out. "You and all your companions, even those two. If you try to imprison me, you reveal yourself without." "Get on with it, Lord Augusto," Tredegar said. "Your voice irritates, I must admit." Tristan's hand went for his pistol, Young's pistol, but something about the pleasantness on Tredegar's face stopped him. She did not usually feign a good mood when denied something, and they all knew she badly wanted Augusto Cherdon dead. Instead he stepped forward, up to her side, and waited to let this play out. It did not feel like a done thing, not yet. Angharad watched as Augusto Cherdon slunk away, smirking, and wondered what he even thought he might achieve by going towards the palisade. Ultimately, she did not care enough to ask. Glancing at the Sacramontan who had just joined her, she inclined her head in a greeting he returned. "Tristan," she said. "I believe you own a pocket watch. Might I borrow it?" The Sacramontan eyed her curiously, but he nodded and fished out the piece. It was simple but lovely work, Angharad found, polished bronze that popped open with ease. She marked the position of the needles, the lateness of the hour. It was 4:15 past midnight. The Perdiri delicately pushed the hour needle forward, all the way around the watch twice until it came to rest at 4:15 again. Nodding her thanks at Tristan, she handed him back his watch as he watched her bemusedly. "Song," she said. "If I could have the use of your musket?" The Tianxi cocked an eyebrow but passed her firearm without asking why. Angharad aimed it, trying to recall what little she knew of using guns, and Song sighed. Like this, the other woman said, leaning close to adjust her stance with gentle nudges. Angharad raised the gun until it was of a height with her cheek, the butt near the crook of her elbow, and breathed out before placing her shot and pulling the trigger. Flint sparked, powder caught and smoke billowed out. The bullet took Augusto in the back of the knee, though she had been aiming for the leg. "Thank you," Angharad politely said, passing the musket back. Song looked baffled, opening her mouth then closing it, and the Perduri left her behind as she strolled after Augusto. The Cheriton was screaming and rolling on the floor, his shot knee a bloody ruin. Though his cloak was in the way, he ripped clear his sword when he heard Angharad coming. Wordlessly, she unsheathed her saber. "You bitch," Augusto snarled. "You took an oath." "You followed it to the word exact," Angharad mildly said. "Is it no fault of mine that you bargained poorly?" 24 hours had passed on Tristan's watch. She was, thus, free of her oath. She stood there patiently, waiting for him to drag himself up on his pulpney. The only reason she had shot him was so that he would not be able to run into the woods and hide. With a hoarse scream, Augusto Cheriton got up, leaning on his sword for help. "We will begin at your leisure," she informed him. "Prepare as you will, no others will intervene, it is yet a matter of honor." Something halfway between hate and disbelief bubbled up onto his face as he realized that this was not simple killing but exactly what she had promised, an honor duel. "You demented fucking girl," he breathed out. "You're still on about Gascon even now?" Most scholars agreed that if an opponent was capable of talking without difficulty, they should be considered fit to fight. Disinclined to walk too close to the line, Angharad flicked up her sword in a slow movement. A warning, which Augusto heeded. Screaming, he charged at her. The man was fit and from the way he held his blade had been schooled in swordplay, but he was wounded and raw. It did not matter, even at his best there would have been no doubt about the outcome. Angharad stepped around his blow, coat trailing behind her, as her footing drifted and she placed her blow to the man's stumbling back. She slashed through his cape and clothes, carving into muscle and bone, and Augusto dropped with a scream. She moved around his flailing, careful to avoid his touch. Song had said it was all his contract required to be used. "You can't," Augusto snarled. "You promised," Tredegar promised. "You have to let me go, Mulaney can't just lie." The point of her saber went right through his throat, a clean thrust. "Perduri," Angharad coldly corrected. "As you once told your brother, there is a difference. Had you believed your own words, you might have lived through this." She ripped out her blade, and with it the Infant's life. Angharad did not offer a blade salute, for the corpse was undeserving of the honor, but she went through her pockets and dropped her last handful of coins on his chest as custom dictated. That was the real choice, wasn't it? The fisher pretended that it was either black or white, that she could either follow her father into the grave or damn herself to his tune, but that was not the truth of it. No empty salute, but copper for the grave. That was a choice, just like when she used the words exact. To judge who deserved honor in spirit and who deserved it to the letter was not some cliff she was tumbling on the edge of, some disease or addiction. It was just a choice. There was nothing mystical about it. And maybe there would come a day where the hate and fear cracked her faith, where the remembrance of the screams on the wind had her cast away her honor for a ruinous oath, but that was not an excuse. She knew better. That was the first and last lesson of mirror dancing. To fight yourself was to lose. That was why no stripe was added after the 10th, no matter how many times one danced with the mirror afterwards. Theirs was not the boast of Mulaney swordmasters, each line a fresh victory, but a simpler declaration. To be a swordmaster was to prevail over others, to be a mirror dance was to prevail over yourself. To surpass your limits, your weaknesses. The 10th time the mirror was danced was merely proof the dancer had chosen their path and would walk it until the end found them. For the moment the dance began, defeat began walking your way from the other end of the road. There was no telling when it would find you, where and facing who, but what did that matter? The mirror always won, eventually. You could not win against yourself forever, no more than you could win against tide and storm. But it wasn't the end that mattered, it was the fight. And Angharad, as she sheathed her saber, decided that she had it in her to fight. Chapter 45. Tristan counted as the blade went through Augusto Cerdon's throat. Though he allowed himself a moment to bask in the satisfaction of yet another Cerdon put in the ground, some precautions were in order. Clearing his throat, he leaned in to politely ask Cellini to shoot Augusto in the head twice more just to be sure. The gunslinger snorted but shot the possibly dead Infanzon in the head and heard a heartbeat later. By simple hand, not using her contract, as the unnecessarily flashy spinning of her pistols proved. Tredegar gave them a mildly disapproving look, but Tristan was unwilling to take a risk with a Red Maw contract. With reason, a heartbeat later, Augusto's corpse began shriveling up. It shook and warped and ate itself from the inside, until the cadaver was little more than brown leather with a massive stomach wound going through it. When it finally stopped moving, cracking open like a clay left to dry in the glare for too long, a hush fell over their group. "I take back the snort," Cellini finally said. "Well done, man." Tristan tipped his tricorn back. It was not every day he got to arrange the desecration of an Infanzon's corpse and come off better for it. Tredegar cleared her throat, looking embarrassed. Like some slip of a girl at her first dance instead of the whirlwind of death that had casually torn through a man and coldly executed another on a technicality. The thief doubted he would ever get used to that gap. "Yes, indeed," Angharad said. "I had thought him dead. Fair be fair, she had stabbed him to death. And she was owed some courtesy for scratching another name off his list without bringing any suspicion onto him." "I expect any of us would have been, in his place," Tristan said. "But Lord Augusto contracted with a god of the old night, and these are made of sterner stuff. The gods that had ruled Vesper before Morn's arrival might have been toppled from their thrones, but even their remnants were fearsome things." "Eh?" Fortuna sniffed disdainfully, leaning on his shoulder. "We could walk that off too, I'm pretty sure. Asked the girl to shoot you too." The lady of long odds went ignored, as was her due. By the flicker of gratitude on Tredegar's face she seemed to believe he was being polite instead of truthful, which was mildly amusing as for once he had been entirely forthright with her. The Hollows with Lord Augusto spoke of a hidden passage out of Kentica hidden nearby, one of them even finding it. The thief continued. "If you give me a moment to look we should be able to leave this town behind at last." "That would be lovely," Lord Zenzel croaked out. He'd been helped out of the alley by Ferranda, who looked rather worried at the state of him. Not without reason, given his gut wound and missing eye, but Tristan gave him decent odds of surviving now. Had they been out in the wilds the Milani would have been good as a corpse, but now the watch was here. The bleeding alone shouldn't kill Zenzel, and with a proper physician taking care of him the Milani should be able to avoid infection, the complication most likely to send him for another spin of the circle. It took Tristan a little under a minute to find the hidden passage out Kentica. It was nothing more than a shallow gap under the palisade, just large enough to squeeze through if you were willing to eat some dirt, but it would serve well enough. Earlier it had been concealed by a rock in an angle in the dirt. Someone had raised a slight slope on the side to make it less obvious to the eye, but the fleeing slave hadn't bothered to put those back after she messed them up going through. After calling out his find to the others, Tristan allowed the tension in his shoulders to loosen. With the passage found there would be no talk of riding out the watch assault in the jail, and so no need to explain Cosmo Flora's corpse. The thief honestly believed he would have been able to talk himself out of that grave, but it would be best never to step in it if he could. Though the tallest among them, Zenzel and Angharad, looked somewhat queasy at the prospect of having to go through that narrow a gap, no one argued against leaving Kentica. It yet remained a risk they might get caught between the watch sweep and some fleeing cultists, or worse some feet-dragging devils. They set up a rear guard to cover themselves and began crossing, Tristan the first through. Dragging his belly through the dirt, the thief emerged into faded yellow grass. He made room for Ferranda Vilazar, dusting himself off as he got onto his feet. There was no sign of the hollow girl from earlier, but then if she had any wits at all she'd still be running. Song had mentioned something about the watch encircling the town, but unless the garrison in Three Pines was much larger than the supplies on the Bluebell had implied the encirclement would not be airtight. She had a shot at making it through. Fishing his tricorn out of the bag he'd put it in for the crossing, the thief patted the worst of the dust off it and put it back on. Much better. You do know that hat is a decade out of fashion, yes? Lady Ferranda sadly said. The Infanzona looked bruised and tired, but like him the relief at escaping Kentika was lending her a second breath. The current fashion involves feathers, Velazar, Tristan disdainfully replied. If I were meant to be a bird, I would have been born one. The Infanzona traced the circle on her left shoulder, lips twitching. That's heresy, she informed him. Palingenicism, to be exact. Only Someshwari cults argue the circle can spin us into animals. Well, they must have the right of it, the thief easily said, for how would you explain the Cherden if not a past life as some manner of pig? She choked, and was still laughing when Song emerged from the gap and asked what they were speaking about. The heresy inherent to the Persine condition, he told the Tiangxi. I am impressed that you would admit to being pig-headed, Song replied without batting an eye, but it is hardly heresy, Tristan. Don't be so hard on yourself. Harsh, Ferranda appreciated. And now the nobility was conspiring with foreigners to take advantage of good, honest Sacramontan folk. Typical. Instead of allowing himself to be further tarred and feathered, the thief, as honest a profession as any in the city, suggested they start a makeshift camp if they were to remain out here until the watch was finished with Kentika. There was no telling how long it would take, after all. Song pointed out to Pitman for a burning trash that he'd missed a dozen feet to their left and Ferranda volunteered to get a fire started. She recruited him as labor, seeming surprised when he admitted he knew little of how to use a flint and tinder. It wasn't his fault, the thief thought with irritation, that his lessons about lighting fires had been strictly about arson, an exercise that usually required more elaborate tools than sharp rocks and kindling. There was still some leftover trash in the pit, mostly animal bones and pottery shards, but luckily there were some logs left as well. It was enough for the Infanzona to get the fire going while he served as a glorified windbreak for her efforts, though they might need to venture out for firewood if the flames were kept going for long. The rest trickled in one after another, the only trouble coming with Zenzel. He needed help on both sides, Tredegar pushing him from one and Shalini dragging him up from the other. The tricky part was doing that without ripping his wounds open further, but they seemed to manage decently enough. Though the 7 of them kept their weapons close, as they settled around the somewhat stinking fire they unbent some. The battle was not finished, the shots and shouts from inside Kentika made that much clear, but their part in it was. Even if there were still devils or cultists around, they were much more likely to be hiding than looking for a fight. Wary as they still were, the heat of the fire and the relative safety greased the wheels enough for conversation to start. Mostly about what had taken place since they parted ways. That led to an unpleasant surprise. Land ran for the south when the cultists came out of the woods, Ferranda said. One of them winged her with a musket shot, and though Lady Angharade tried to help her back up, I was too late, Tredegar sadly said. The bullet caught her in the face. Death was instant. Tristan's jaw clenched and he ignored Mariam's searching gaze. Lan had not been a friend and barely a companion, there was no need for pity. He was surprised, that was all. The thief had honestly thought Lan would make it to the end, clever and careful as she was. And she almost had, but almost never counted. If she had not run, then. Well, there was no telling. Perhaps the cultists would have fired at the others instead, killed Song or Ferranda. Instead Lan had made herself the standout target and paid for it. All it took was one mistake. Now that we know the watch has encircled the town, I wonder if the cultists were not fleeing blast cloaks, Song said, looking into the flames. They were quite intent on following us into the town, desperate almost. I imagine we will be able to ask the rooks if we survive the night, Shalini sighed, then quirked an eyebrow at them. And what were you lot up to? You were missing too. The watch's shelling of Kentika effectively announced the end of the trial of weeds, and thus any possible justification for maintaining the truce, Zenzel Duma calmly said. I sought justice for Ayanda against the last remaining architect of her death. That got everyone talking, the Milani lord withstanding the storm of worry and cheering and disapproval with remarkable aplomb for a man who must be barely staying conscious. Miriam was praised for doubling back and helping him after Tupac made his escape, ignoring her insistence that she was avoiding the same cultists they ended up fleeing, and with its skein laid out the conversation turned to Tristan's part. "I ran after Cosme, but he is quick and my leg is wounded," the thief said. "I had to stop when I encountered two devils headed for the front gate, and after that I headed to the jail to wait this all out. The other two caught up to me there." "I have not seen Cosme Flor since he ran off," Zenzel mildly said. "He might well be dead." Tristan carefully did not smile at the lordling, who was beginning to grow on him. Milani, he thought, were rather reliable when you had them in your debt. Zenzel Duma would now consider them square for the thief having seen to his wounds earlier, but that was fine by him. Those 2 sentences had been more than fair payment for the service. It didn't matter if they weren't entirely believed, as between he and Zenzel they had enough people invested in their telling of it being true that there would be no argument. Song's silver gaze lingered on them both, but she had no horse in this race, so why bother? The sole danger came when he glimpsed doubt in Tredegar's gaze, more directed at Zenzel than himself, interestingly enough. Whatever her suspicions, they never passed her lips. It looked like Tristan might just have got away with it. They all saw it when the ambush was sprung south of Kentika. The night broke as a thunderous volley lit up the woods along the dirt road, screams resounding all the way to their fire. Though they tensed, several bringing up weapons, no one came their way. The shots were irregular after that, as if the blast cloaks had been freed to fire at will, but large pillars of pale light rose from the depths of the woods. Glare lanterns, and not small ones. The fighting went on for a few minutes more, but not much longer than that. It must have been a massacre. Angharad could not muster much sympathy for cultists and devils, though she felt a pang of worry at the thought that some slaves might have been caught up in the slaughter. Hopefully most would have stayed inside Kentika, where the watchmen would see to their safety as they swept through the town. That part of the battle must be close to done as well, for it had been some time since a shot had last sounded within the palisade. What parts of it were not aflame, anyhow? Angharad wondered if Tristan even realized his careless gesture had turned half the town into Young's funeral pyre. They had been encamped around the fire for barely more than an hour when finally they saw movement. A party that must have come through the front gate was approaching at a brisk pace. A dozen men, which had them all reaching for arms until Song made out the black cloaks. Even more reassuring, 2 of the watchmen seemed to be carrying a stretcher. Their company got on their feet as the blast cloaks approached nonetheless. A tall woman with the Someshwari looked to her approaching ahead of the rest. "Sergeant Hina," she brusquely introduced herself. "We were sent to fetch you and pick up your wounded, but first I need names and a head count." That much was easily provided while Zenzel was helped into the stretcher under Firanda's watchful eye. The sergeant, openly tired and her cheek touched with ash, squinted down at a paper in her hand that might be the Bluebell Manifest and sighed. "Were there any other survivors?" Angharad asked. She suspected not, given how very exactly Zenzel had spoken about Cosme Flor. The only thing that had stilled her tongue was that she could honestly think of no reason for the other noble to want the man dead. "Tupac Sickle," the sergeant replied. He joined in the scrap with the saint around the town square and made enough of an impression the cabal sent in by Commander Artelas personally debriefing him. No others were found. Tupac. Of course the smug Eastli was still alive. What, Angharad indignantly thought, was it going to take to kill that man? Zenzel's face was cold even as he lay down on the stretcher, but he did not seem truly angry. Perhaps he had expected it, for deep down the Perdiri suspected none of them had truly thought Tupac would die in the chaos. Chaos was where he thrived most. "Now I've a few items to cross off my list," Sergeant Hina said. "Firanda Velazar, your attention." Lady Firanda tore her gaze away from Zenzel, looking surprised. "You have it." The sergeant cleared her throat, and when she spoke it was in the voice of someone reciting something by rote. "Given the casualty rates this year and your performance during the trials, Captain Mateo has been instructed to make you 2 offers," the older Someshwari said. One of them is going back to Sacramento on the next ship out. Miranda's lips thinned. She had already expressed having no intention of returning to her house and responsibilities. And the other? The captain is in town, Sergeant Hina shrugged. Speak to him and find out. The Infanzona hesitated. So I will, she said. Good, the sergeant nodded, gaze going through them until it came to rest on Tristan. Tristan Abrascal. Angharade was mildly surprised to find he had a surname, given he had not used it even when naming himself to the sergeant. How odd. There would have been fewer doubts about his skill as a physician had he demonstrated having a background fitted to such a trade. Possibly, Tristan said. Who's asking? The watch officer rolled her eyes. An officer was supposed to meet you in Three Pines, but sends word she cannot, the sergeant said. She was summoned to the rookery and will seek you out herself afterwards. The Sacramentan was usually a guarded man, Angharade had found, and so it was all the more noticeable when his emotions were laid bare for half a heartbeat. Hope and fear and anger, all in one, so intertwined she could hardly tell them apart. And then it was gone in a heartbeat, all tucked away behind a pleasant smile. Curiosity itched away at Angharade. Who was it that had the gray-eyed man looking so raw? Family? A lover? Understood, Tristan said. Right, the sergeant nodded. We're all finished here, then, save for those of you with that last bit of business. Business, Shalini repeated. Whose? Not for me to decide, Sergeant Hina said. Her gaze swept through them. You are all free to come into town, the sergeant said. Kentucky has been secured and in an hour or two we'll be sending the wounded to Three Pines in a convoy. You'll be sent off with them. She then sought out Song with her eyes, sorry after. That said, Song ran, Mariam Kamef. Captain Mateo sends word that the trials are officially at an end and thus you are no longer bound to secrecy. Who is it you need? Much appreciated, Sergeant, Song calmly replied. We need only speak with Lady Angharade and Tristan, unless— No, sorry, Mariam? Said, sounding mildly amused. I have not changed my mind. Song sighed. Lady Angharade and Tristan, she confirmed. I'll leave you to it, then, Sergeant Hina said, offering a nod. Least I can do, given the sheer nerve of what you did. Been the talk of the barracks for weeks, I don't mind telling you. Angharade flicked a glance at Tristan, finding him unsurprised. Song had told the noblewoman she would have an offer her at the end of the trials. Had Mariam told him the same? Both Shalini and Firanda looked intrigued that they were not being kept back, but little more than that. Exhaustion blanketed them all. As for Zenzel, one of the watchmen was making him drink from a flask and he was not paying attention to much of anything. Goodbyes were short, given that they should only be parting ways for a short time, and when the watchmen marched away the others went with them. It left the four of them alone around the fire, and for lack of anything better to do as the silence thickened Angharade sat back down. She and Tristan on one side, Mariam and Song on the other. The pale-skinned of the two women glanced at the other, as if to urge her on, and Song cleared her throat. I would have preferred to have this conversation over warm meal and with walls around us, but the gods are fickle things, she said. I must begin by clarifying something. Not all trial takers are equal, no matter the year, but this one particularly so. Several among us were, in a word, recommended. She paused as if to let that sink in. Finally they were to learn what all that secrecy had been about, Angharade thought. Well overdue. To be specific, the both of you were recommended as candidates to attend Sholomance when it opens in a few months, Song said. The Perduri cocked an eyebrow. She had heard of Sholomance, the ancient school of the watch that had closed for reasons much speculated on, but failed to see why she would be interested in attending such a place even if it opened anew. I thought the purpose of these trials that one would be inducted directly into the ranks of the watch, she said. Why would anyone choose to become a student instead? Ranks is the right word, Song told her. That is what survival buys you, a place in the rank and file of the watch, serving as a soldier of the garrison or enrolling with one of the free companies. It will be years before you will be considered for an officer's rank, much less a position of influence. She paused. Students of Sholomance, upon graduation, are ordained as members of Covenant, what you will have heard called the 7 Circles of the Watch. In your cases, the same Covenant willing to sponsor your candidature in the first place. The silver-eyed woman flicked a glance at Tristan. Cryptia, she said, then turned to Angharad. And Skiratai. That is where you are headed to, should you accept. The gray-eyed Sacromontan did not look surprised at the news, unlike her. She very much doubted that her helpless uncle was a member of the militants, the finest soldiers of the Watch, so he must have pulled strings somehow. Between his apparently having some strings to pull and the false year Etsy claiming he had spent a fortune assassinating her would-be assassins, Angharad was beginning to realize she knew much less about Ocean Tredegar than she had thought. How long? Tristan asked. The education, that is. 5 years, Sare, Mariam replied. Students will be split into classes according to Covenant and taught by veterans from it. There is more to it, Angharad said. You said you would have an offer for me, Song, but this is not it. I expect a watchman will make this offer again, formally. What is it you want from me? Tredegar's got it right, Tristan said, cocking his head to the side. What's the deal, Mariam? The two women traded glances. This offer was made by a member of the Watch, Angharad, Song finally said. I have been one for 2 years now. Angharad stilled, so many pieces coming together. No wonder the Tianxi had been able to get her hands on a map of the Dominion of Lost Things. The Watch would not deny one of their own. A little longer for me, Mariam said, but it doesn't matter much. What does is that the two of us are headed for Sholomance when it opens. Tristan let out an amused noise. By the ends of these trials I will be wearing a black cloak, he said, sounding like he was quoting someone. Clever. Mariam smiled back. I try, she said, her false humility distinctly smug. Though the pair was droll to watch, Angharad did not let it distract her. You did not need to take these trials to qualify for Sholomance, she stated. You got in by other means, the same way most the other students will have. So why come here at all? Black cloak or not, Song had come very close to dying several times during the trials. Given that Sare, Mariam, she reminded herself, was hardly a fighter, the risks for her must have been even starker. For the same reason every cheap mercenary company in Vesper has men waiting next to Giles and Gallows, Tredegar, Tristan said. They are looking to recruit from the desperate because no one else will come anywhere near them. Angharad met Song's eyes, and she saw the shadow of a wince in them even though it never reached her face. No one attends Sholomance alone, the Tianxi said. Students are tasked with forming a cabal on the first day, which will undertake the yearly test assigned to all students of Sholomance. The vast majority of students will come from free companies or large garrison fortresses, so they will be sent together as a ready cabal. There are fewer free candidates, and of those, I am Treglau, Mariam bluntly said. Half of them assumed I was a candidate's servant, the other half wanted nothing to do with an ignorant savage from the north. I signed up with Song because she is about as badly off. And that was what befuddled Angharad, for Song did not seem like she should be in such straits, not with her skills, her contract or her character. What did you do? She frankly asked. I was born, Song replied. I am a Ren of Jagong, Angharad. My family is disgraced beyond what words can convey, and cursed for it by 500,000 tongues. No Tianxi will come anywhere near me if they have a choice, and my mere presence would be a stone around the neck of anyone dealing with the republics going forward. A pause. I am also recommended by the Academy and would be the captain of any cabal I am part of unless there is another stripe candidate to choose from, she added. Between that and my family's blackened name, there were few takers. None I would willingly take as comrade. So we looked at the other conduits bringing in Sholomance candidates, Mariam said. Those that aren't as pretty. The Dominion was the most brutal proving ground this year, and so the most likely to have hidden gems in it. Now you're just flattering me, Tristan grinned at her. Do go on. We agreed on one candidate each, as 4 is the smallest accepted number for a cabal, Song said, meeting Angharad's eyes. I picked you. And it would have been a lie to say there was not something of a thrill to the words, to such a skilled person deciding she was the finest pick, but Angharade was not sure she could accept. Not when one day she must leave the watch to take her revenge. Song, she swallowed. The silver-eyed woman rose to her feet. Come, Song said. Walk with me. Tristan did not bother to watch the pair leave. He did not mind making a common cause with Tredegar, even knowing that on occasion he would have to step around her sensibilities, but that was not his trouble to arrange. Instead he sat there with Mariam, warming his hands with the fire. How big do cables get? He asked. 7 at most. You should have tried to grab Zenzel and Shalini then, he mused. Ferrando would not be recommended, although he had some suspicions about the offer she was about to be made by this Captain Mateo. Mariam wiggled her hand in a hedging gesture. It was a favor done to us to be allowed to take the trials at all, she said. If not for putting ourselves in danger we might not have been allowed. The thief hummed with understanding. So taking too many of the spares would be pushing it, he said. The first reason he could think of for the watch drawing candidates through something like the Dominion would be so they could bulk up the number of free candidates, meaning that sucking up too many people was likely to be frowned upon by their superiors. Mariam nodded. They sat there in comfortable silence for a moment, the crackling flames keeping them warm. Why me? He asked. Her brow rose. I thought you were joking about the flattery, Mariam said. He met her eyes. Why me? He simply asked again. She snorted. I was thinking of trying Ishan and Shalini, at first, she said. Song could tell she has contract troubles, it might have been an angle to rope them in. Only when I was thinking about how to go about it, this rat walked up to me. His lips quirked. Your disguise needed work, Tristan said. You had me curious, Mariam said. Even more after we talked near the docks. And I knew with the map in my head I could join up with the Remiant crew at any time, so I could afford to hold back and watch until my curiosity was sated. And then you stuck with us when the group split, he said. She softly laughed. It's easy with you, Tristan, even when you make it hard, the blue-eyed woman said. You have no idea how rare a thing that is for me. He swallowed, faintly embarrassed. Me as well, he admitted. I have not. It was so artless a confession he did not even have the words for it. It won't be easy, even if Tredegar signs up, Mariam suddenly said, serious. The tests in Shalomance, they make us compete against other cables. Most of them will be larger, better trained. And the school itself. She grimaced. There's 100 rumors about why they closed it, back at the rookery, but the one that everyone seems to believe is that the casualty rates were unsustainable. And unsustainable was no small word when spoken by the lips of the watch, an institution so large that should all its free companies be counted it might be said to have a larger army than some great powers. Mountains of bodies, it meant. Seas. That will be tricky to navigate, Tristan mused. I wonder what makes it so deadly? They would not purposefully be wasteful, I feel. Mariam's eyes brightened. You'll still come. The rat leaned forward, gently touching her hand. The one where 2 fingers were missing down to the phalange, spent to save his life from his own cleverness. I was always going to agree, Mariam, he gently said. You paid up front. Softly, almost hesitantly, she clasped his hand back. It had been years since someone simply held his hand like that. Had it been as long for her, he wondered. Looking at the faint wonder on her face, he thought it might have. And that he did not want to take back his hand scared him more than anything else on this island had. They did not step past the edge of the woods, but they went far enough that the light of the fire seemed on a distant shore. Song had well weathered the dominion of lost things, Angharade thought. Her collared coat was barely scuffed, her pin had singed at the edge but no more. She was hardly even bruised, and the most unkempt part of her was that her long braid was starting to come undone. That was a rare thing, this island, it had swallowed so many of them and even those it spat out had not come out the same. Angharade thought of the grief in Zenzel's eyes, of bent-back Shalini bearing Ishan's weight and Ferrando leaving all of the Vilazar behind. None of them were the same person that had stepped onto the blue belt, were they? Something inside them had been cut or ripped or burned, and now who they were would walk with that wound until they died. It was not all tragedy. Tristan and Mariam had been strangers a week ago, and now they were joined at the hip, eyes never straying too far from each other. They talked like they'd known each other for years, with that same rare fondness mother had reserved for comrades she had shed blood with. And Angharad herself, she, looking at pale stars above, at the shivering night and the fire that felt like some faraway land, Angharad felt like a stranger still. Peredur was yet home, however forbidden to her. But she had been lost, fleeing across Vesperport by port, and she no longer felt that. She no longer woke smelling smoke, hearing screams on the wind, and though the deaths would never leave her, they were no longer the fullness of her shadow. She had changed. They all had, save for Songren. Song was the same woman she had been on the deck of the Bluebell that first evening, speaking a cryptic warning that went unheeded. Had she ever really lost her cool, even when they almost parted ways over the matter with Isabel? There had been anger, yes, but controlled. The Tianxi had been mistress of herself still. Song had walked through lines and ruins and weeds without a mark, without a loss. Silver as untarnished as that of her eyes. The Tianxi was looking into the woods, at whatever secrets the dark might hide, when she finally broke the silence. "You were added late to the Bluebell's manifest." "My uncle's work," Angharad said. "A man I thought half a stranger but might be that a great deal more." "It caught my attention, the shared last names," Song admitted. "But only so much. It was when the Redcloaks cordoned off an entire dock to catch you and nearly got into a shooting match with the Bluebell that I truly became curious." "I have an enemy," Angharad simply said. There was a cold look on the other woman's face as she gazed into the dark. "I do not have that luxury, myself," Songren said. "To cram all the evils inside one man so I might pull a trigger on him and end it in a stroke. I trying to fill a pit, Angharad, that gets deeper with every breath I take. We broke a ninth of the heavens and my brothers they think they can just—" She breathed in, sharply, then breathed out. "It is not an enemy I face," Song said, voice becalmed. "But I understand what it is, to seek the watch as a means and not an end. In that we are the same. You hesitate because to join a covenant is not something that is easily taken back." "I had thought to enroll for 7 years, Angharad admitted. "Spent 7 years as a foot soldier in a free company or a guard in some garrison fortress and you will be no closer to your ambitions," the silver-eyed woman told her. "You will be able to set some coin aside and make a few petty contacts, but nothing more. 7-year contracts are not held in high esteem." "But the circles are," Angharad said. "Call them covenants," Song said. "Only outsiders call them circles. The watch is a nation of its own, you will learn, with its own tongue and customs." "Covenants, then," Angharad dismissed. "I might know little of the watch's workings, but I do know this, to join a covenant is not sworn in sevens. It is until death." "A retirement," Song said. "That is a right usually awarded only to those who have served for decades, but it can be earned earlier by great deeds. And we will have the opportunity for these." The watch opened Sholomans again for a reason, Angharad. "They are preparing for something." The noblewoman frowned. "For what?" "I do not know," Song admitted. "But what I do know is that as a Skiritai, you would become part of a covenant between the finest killers in all of Vesper. One that will be inclined to do favors even after retirement." "I cannot afford to spend 5 years in a school, Song," Angharad quietly said. "To let the world pass me by. My house deserves better than that. The tests the watch will send our cabal on, they are not some schoolyard brawl," she said. "We will be sent out in the world on genuine contracts. Able to raise our names, to make allies and earn funds." And it was tempting, put that way. Yet it was taking a chance. That Song was right, and she would be able to earn retirement, that she would win enough to justify the spending of years, that. So many things. Perhaps too many of them. But then Angharad had been taking chances ever since she first began running towards the Blue Belt, hadn't she? There was no perfect answer. insisting on one had seen the Guardia kick in her door and seize the last of her possessions in Sacramonte. The temptation was still there to refuse, to look for a path that would give her everything she wanted and cost her nothing, but Angharad had learned not to trust that voice. Last time it had left with nothing but a saber and the clothes on her back. The fire looked so far away, she thought, but home was further away still. And she would need to cross more than water and darkness to return, for though putting on a black cloak would stay her enemy's hand, they would remain out there, waiting, plotting. How much was she willing to pay, to go back home? How much was she willing to leave behind? At least this much, Angharad Tredegar learned. "All right," she murmured. "I'll do it." And somewhere, the fisher laughed.